Welcome everyone to our January club meeting of the Los Alamos Mountaineers. I don't have a lot of announcements. I do want to remind folks that it is the time of year to renew your membership, which you can do online. And I will be giving the trip reports. Bill Priedhorsky is our trip coordinator, usually does that, but since he's giving the presentation, I'm going to give the trip reports, and then Rod will announce our presentation. So next slide, please. Okay, so we've been up to a lot of adventures. I've actually mixed the club trips with our private trips, but I'll try to tell you which ones were club trips as I go along. And actually, Bill put together this presentation. I should give a shout out to Bill. So next slide, please. So Pradorsky did a backpack in October to Trout Creek. Next slide. So you can see the great photography here. I think Reed's a great photographer. Next slide. This was a Mountaineers trip to Bluff that Bill Priedhorsky led December 1st through 5th. Really beautiful landscape. And you can see the participants down in the left-hand corner. Next slide, please. So there's always the hike to Comb Ridge that you do on a Bluff trip. And these are the participants, all smiling. Next slide, please. Beautiful views from Comb Ridge. Next slide. Maggie Schmidt and Lori Lopez did a hike at the Galisteo Basin Preserve. This was a private hike. Next slide. Bill actually led a trip that he gave out at very short notice. This was a Mountaineers trip to Duchess Castle and beyond on December 26th. Next slide. So some of the interesting features that were seen on this hike. Next slide. And the beautiful landscapes, beautiful views. Next slide. Evan Rose had a private trip to Rockhound State Park, December 27th. Next slide. Zach Baker actually led a Mountaineers trip up the Cañada Bonita Trail. This was a cross-country ski trip to kind of get people used to their skis for the season, and you can actually see the nice view at the end of the trail. Next slide, please. Jean Dewart led a trip to Cumbres Pass, January 8th. Again, beautiful views. Next slide. And here are the participants. Next slide. Don Creer went to the Brazos Overlook, January 9th. This is a 7-mile ski trip. Again, a nice cross-country view. Some of the folks on the trip. Next slide. And very nice views again. Next slide. Let's see. Alan went to Egypt on a very adventurous trip. Next slide. Some of the different locations that he saw. Abu Sibil in Karnak. Next slide. And Luxor. So very spectacular trip. Actually, myself and my husband went up the Grouse Creek Trail near Cumbres Pass. Some of the trail there, very nice cross-country skiing, about an 8-mile round trip ski trip. Next slide. There's kind of the end of the trip near the Grouse Creek Yurt. Next slide. And you can actually see the Sangre de Crisco Mountains, actually Blanca Peak in the distance. Next slide. Lisa Andretta went to the White Sands, January 15th. Next slide. She also went to previous slide, Basca del Apache to watch the ascension of the cranes. Next slide. There was another Mountaineers trip that Bill led to Salida, where they went to Monarch to ski and to cross-country ski and to snowshoe. So here are some of the people at the Continental Divide, snowshoeing, I think, in this case. Next slide. And one of the downhill skiers. at the Monarch Ski Basin. Next slide. Zach Baker with Jean Dewart led a joint PEEC Mountaineers trip, which was a Las Conchas snowshoe. So here's the crew. Next slide. And here they are hiking along the way. This was actually a shuttle trip. Nice trip. Next slide. So I'm just going to talk about the upcoming trips. Actually, most of the day trips during the season are kind of given out at reasonably short notice, like a week or less, because you have to adjust to the conditions. And as you saw, we led a lot of trips recently. Two of the longer trips, one of them is the Willow Patch Llama Trip, which actually has two sections. That's May 17th through 15th and May 18th through 16th. There is currently a waiting list of one for that trip, so it's basically filled. And then there's another llama trip to Ladder Canyon to Silver Falls in October 10th through the 19th. There's one slot left in that trip.
Hello, Rod McCready here. I'm the program coordinator. So I'll make my usual plea that if you have taken a trip or know somebody who has, that's worthy of a program, and it doesn't take a whole lot. If you can just talk about something for 45 minutes, please let me know. Right now I've booked talks up through May, so I'm looking for talks for June and beyond, and would love to hear your ideas. And a lot of great talks come to us this way. Tonight's speaker, Bill Priedhorsky, that's a name I'm sure almost everybody here recognizes, if not everybody. He's very visible within the club, very active in the club, and leads lots and lots of trips. He grew up in Tacoma, Washington, with some other brief stays in other areas due to his dad being in the military. He told me that his first big adventure that he remembers was shortly after graduating from high school. So his parents didn't drag him around hiking the way some of us do to our kids. But he hiked around Mount Rainier shortly after graduating from high school with just gear that he scrounged up. In 1978, he moved to Los Alamos, and his group leader and he connected with the Mountaineers, sort of trying to plan a trip. So he said his first Mountaineers trip was in 1979 to Dark Canyon. Some of you may have been on that trip and remember it. He did take the climbing school in the 1980s. And he said one of his real favorite things about the club is leading the trips and getting to know all the people and getting out for the big adventures. Like I said, he's very active with the club. He's been on the board, I think, the entire time I've been on the board, which is a few years. And I know long before that he has too. So he's been president a number of times. He's currently trip coordinator, I think. I can't remember because he does move to whatever role he's needed in and puts a lot of effort into it. And he was made a lifetime member of the club, which is sort of, you might consider it a club fellow. So without further ado, let's welcome Bill Priedhorsky.
Thank you, and I am glad to be here. Well, I basically want to share with you what I've been doing all my life. I trust the sound is good. If not, somebody will squawk here over chat or somewhere else. And what I've been doing is spending a lot of time in the Canyon Country, which is, you know, since that 1979 trip turned out to be my favorite place in the world. So let's talk about it. This is a pastel that my wife did of a scene in the bottom of Dark Canyon, Melissa Bartlett's art. You know, what is the Canyon Country? It's southeastern Utah and northeastern Arizona. It is really unique in the world. It's got water, it's got bare rock, which we call slick rock. It's got you know, steep canyons, domes, pillars, and we are just so privileged to be a day's drive away from it. So that's what I would call the Canyon Country, that piece of Utah. And it was one of the last spots in the United States to be explored. In 1869, the United States was a pretty civilized place. But if you look at this piece of the Canyon Country, it was a blank spot on the map up to that time. Even at that time, just the rivers called out. If you zoom in, there is a lot of unknown, and I don't know that these, well, a couple of these mountains are right, and some of them are sort of imagined as of after the Civil War. Let me back up a bit here. So I'd like to map out what I've been doing. I think I'm at like 120 multi-day trips to the Canyon Country, backpacks, llama trips, and the like. And here's how they've mapped out over the years, over the decades. A lot of attention early on to the Navajo country, which is unique and remote in its own way. Most of these earlier trips were backpack trips. We were young, we were energetic, we didn't mind carrying stuff on our back. You can see Dark Canyon that I'll talk about later, some excursions to the Mogollon Rim of Arizona. And you can also see there's so much detail in this country, so much to see, that it doesn't hurt to come back again and again and again. And the next canyon 2 miles over will be a whole different world and worth exploring in its own right. So we finished the decade of the 1990s, we're into the 2000s. And we're starting to throw in some trips in town, like a series of bluff trips, which we tended to do in February. That was before I started up skiing. And a lot of llama trips around Escalante, where there's been some llama packers in operation over the past decades, and they can walk your gear in. You don't have to carry it. Oops, bluff came to an end here because my skiing resumed, or just around that time. And you can see up in the upper right corner, a series that we found this lodge in Moab, from which we're able to keep ourselves busy for a week, exploring the backcountry of that part of the world. I'll talk about that later in the talk. So 120 some trips, and yet I feel like I'm still scratching the surface, and there's so many surprises to be found around the next corner. Blanding was an interesting trip. Our llama trip got rained out. We found a base of operations in town and day hiked, and that was a wonderful non-llama trip. You can see a theme in Moab developing in the upper right corner. My first raft trip on the Grand Canyon. And the trips continuing into this decade. So that's what I've been up to for the last 43 years or so. Excuse me, wrong direction. So let's talk about some of the early trips. I'd like to reminisce here. People that are no longer with us, people that are no longer connected. My very first trip was to Dark Canyon. We'll hit that later. The Navajo country offered us a lot of adventure. We quit going, kind of due to the complications of, you can get a permit, you can go there. It's not so easy. In the past, we just went. This was a destination which the Mountaineers went to a lot. Peach Wash, that's Navajo Mountain in the distance to the north of us. And Peach Wash, young Hank Blackwell, waving at us there, starts as a little groove in the rock and turns into a slot canyon, the bottom of which you can barely see. Eroded by water into fantastic shapes. And here's gear, backpacking gear circa 1980. Gore-Tex tents, bad idea, but I had one. They can't possibly work, and they don't. As Peach Wash came in down into the larger drainage called Chol Canyon, you can see what the erosive forces of desert floods can do to a sandstone landscape over the years. Little pockets. I think that's John Saraceno, a guy named Fred Gamalobo at the top left. And here we are crawling around that maze of little water pockets and features. Waterfall coming from the side, turning sandstone into a sculpture. John Saraceno, still around and active, about to disappear into the quicksand. Backpack, circa 1980, old-fashioned frame pack on his back. Serious about photography then as he is now. And just water makes all these things, the erosive force of water. Shoal Canyon has some parts you have to swim through. One trip later on, we brought in a little pack raft to try to make our way up and through the waterfall in the background, which I don't think we made it up and over this trip. We found a way to get up at a later trip. And there's a few of us at the trailhead celebrating after a successful trip. Other trips in the canyon country, in the Navajo country. The little bit damaged photo on the right, but there in fact is our buddy young Dennis Brandt, circa 1982. So we talked about Dark Canyon. This is my very first backpack in the canyon country, thanks to Hank Blackwell, who was the leader who brought me into the Mountaineers. And Dark Canyon, this is Highway 95 that runs from Blanding to Hanksville, crossing the Colorado River. When there's a lot of water, the reservoir runs up under that bridge. Dark Canyon is close to 1,000 feet deep, running off of the Cataract Canyon of the Colorado River, and has multiple drainages. And what I want to point out is, a standard route in here. Our early first trip was down Black Steer Canyon cross country and made our way down canyon, up and out. And Young's Canyon with fabulous pools is here. And the third trip I talk about, we went in from the top in an exploratory trip trying to find our way down. October 1979, here's the height and immensity of Dark Canyon as we work our way down Black Steer. And though it's dry, at the point you hit Dark Canyon at the bottom of Black Steer, water starts running, and soon enough, there's pools you can do laps in. A lot of water, a lot of perennial water in Dark Canyon. That's one of the wonderful things about it. This was a pretty wild place in 1979. The Blacktop Highway that we came in off of it's the Bicentennial Highway. That's 1976, just three years before. So this is Dave Brown behind Roland Pettit, who wrote a well-known guide to the Jemez country, passed away about 10 years or so thereafter. And the Mountaineers at camp. This scene is not wildly different from what you might see in a Mountaineers camp nowadays, 4 decades later. Wildlife. And this, in fact, if this is the photo that the pastel is based off of, pools you can do laps in. We went back again. This time I was leading down the classic Sundance Trail, which is near a junction of 3 side canyons, Lean-To Lost, and the Dark Canyon going upstream and Dark Canyon going down. Spring trip, flowers in bloom. Jan Studebaker and Elizabeth Kelly sharing dinner. That's young Kathleen Gritzmacher and Gracia Coffin on the right, sharing a backpack meal at the bottom of Dark Canyon. And this is a kind of obstacle you can swim to and try to climb up. There I am, enjoying a wash off. So we explore, and we're always exploring. And that's the wonderful thing about the canyon country, is you're going places you've never known before, and sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. In this case, at the confluence of Young's Canyon and Dark Canyon, there's a wonderful set of pools. And we thought, well, let's go down Young's Canyon and try to get to those pools more directly than what is a fairly long hike upstream up Dark Canyon from along the standard backpack route. So off we went. We made our way cross country. And this, in fact, is shortly after I met my wife, Melissa Bartlett, and Pam Fukushima on the left there. And cross country doesn't always work. We hiked along, and suddenly the canyon dropped away in a big cliff. and we spent a better part of a day trying to work our way around this first obstacle. But we took time to relax. There's the young ladies at leisure. Some of our friends, you can see how it is, in fact, one rock strata dropping off after another. We did move the whole group down below the first big waterfall and made a camp there. But to get down the second big waterfall, or that is to bypass it and head to the pools, only a few of us did that as a day trip. There's the young couple. There we are looking down into Dark Canyon, or rather into Young's Canyon as it makes its way down to Dark. And, here's the point of the trip. We didn't get to spend a long time there, but these emerald pools are just gorgeous. And there was a water slide. Relaxing over dinner, Barry Smith on the far left. Backpacking, you can see how rugged it is. And let's see. So the ladies are in pretty good shape here between the bugs and the rock and so on. Melissa does call this trip, in retrospect, the Valley of the Battered Women, because folks were a little beat up by the time they got done with it. Further explorers over the years. This is Jan Studebaker, sadly, pretty disabled mentally at this point, but he was the bravest among us at one point. Let's move forward a few decades, and now we're in the era of llama trips. And this was a trip that was as the packers described it, the biggest floods and the heaviest rain, I think in my experience, probably in the last century in the Canyon Country, came in October 2006. And we had a llama trip planned. And by the time we were done, we were off on not plan A, not plan B, not plan C, something farther down the list, but we made a wonderful time of it regardless. And the reason this trip was such an adventure is that this is not our photo. This is off to the, it is not far away, and this is the Escalante River itself. So we were exploring in the uplands just a day or two after the Escalante River looked like this. In the few days of this trip, in the few days before this trip, I think Lake Powell rose 3 feet from the influx in the very heavy rainstorms. So first and main, let's talk about where we are in the world. In the lower left corner, right corner, is Lake Powell, the flooded Colorado River. Here's the Henry Mountains, the last part of the last mountain range in the lower 48 to be discovered. Here's the Escalante River. The little town of Boulder, Utah is this green spot here, often a base for our operations. And what John Wesley Powell called the Aquarius Plateau is less poetically nowadays named the Boulder Mountain, but that is the high country that overlies this huge slick rock terrain, which we come back to again and again. So let's zoom into a piece of that terrain. And in fact, you have a piece of it where the drainages go one way, the cracks in the earth go the other. It's almost like a street system. And that's why it's called First and Main. We discovered it by accident, but it was well known. We thought we were finding something cool, but you look at the texture of that country. So we planned the trip. These are complicated trips. You plan them sometime in advance, and you deal with the weather that you get, because it all works out. So this is in fact what the weather looked like even during our trip after the heavy rains. This is not bad news to have wet weather, to have rain in the Canyon Country. It's a special thing. Water flows in ways that are spectacular and almost poetic coming off the slick rock. And you just dress up, you keep warm, and a little rain shelter is not a bad thing to have. So we are at camp above the canyons that you saw in that terrain, and we walked around a wet sandstone landscape. And wet is gorgeous. Rainbow is always a harbinger of better times and of good luck, and we had that. if you look at the complexity of the landscape, you see a major factor that brings me and a lot of folks back to it, which is there's a surprise around every corner. There's always something new to be seen. Here we are exploring the high points that one can see from camp. And Google Maps, these these spires that you can see on Google camp maps are in fact a beautiful ridge, which we saw every night from camp, sunset view, one of the last nights of the trip. There's the gang. These are popular trips. We often fill them up with as many people as the llama folks will have, and rock in one shape after another. Maybe Elizabeth Kelly and perhaps Marilyn Yeamans on top of a spire with Dave Scudder. So let's talk a little bit about llama packing. We started hiring packers in about the year 2000, when the oldest among our crew started to say, gee, that backpack is heavy. I don't know if I can do it anymore. I think I can't go. And I said, there's got to be an idea. Let's make it work. So we see Dennis Brandt in the foreground, Mary Thompson in the back, Jen Studebaker, Terry Morgan on the far left. And here we are about to set out on a llama trip. Our gear has been loaded in what's called panniers, which ride one on each side of a llama and can total up to 70 pounds. So a llama trip gives you, since we have one llama per person, you're able to carry about twice the payload to camp as a backpacker can, and be twice as comfortable in several ways. You get a chair, you get tables to cook on, you get a 2-burner stove, you get a wine cellar. That's what a 70-pound payload can do for you. You know, our gear packed in small duffels, ready to go into the panniers as we're packing. We have lined up the panniers, and then one brings the llamas down this road and loads them up one at a time. And that, in fact, is a llama. Not your friend, not your enemy. They're just there to do their job and ready to accept the panniers and without too much complaint, head down the trail carrying your gear. Llama equals moving backpack. That's me with my llama non-friend, but my llama pack carrier, which is what the point was. And Kathleen Gertzmacher leading a llama off in the country. In fact, in the llama trips, typically the packer comes in with a couple of people, so there might be 3 of them. They are happy, in fact, anxious to have a few of us lead a llama in and out, just so they don't have a train of more than 3 llamas apiece themselves. And we get kind volunteers like Kathleen to do the llama packing. So let's talk about the Escalante country. We come back there a lot because it's gorgeous. The llama packer is there, but we'd probably be coming back there anyway. You know, the metropolises in the Escalante country are the tiny town of Boulder up towards the top, 300 people. Escalante, which has become more and more of a friendly tourist welcome type place since the National Monument was started about the year 2000. And you could put a pin on this map and you would find somewhere interesting to go, anywhere with any relief, anywhere near water. And in fact, there's a lot of water. It's the desert. There's plenty of water. You can go set up a camp, and you can't camp. You know, you talk to some horse packers who say, oh, I went here and carried my water. And you can do that with a big pack animal for a night or two. If you want to settle in for the several days that we want it is appropriate for exploring, you need water. So let's zoom into this country again. And we are going to talk about trips to a trip to Anton Flat, including one recently concluded, and then many trips along the Escalante River to the south. So this is what we did this fall. Here we are 42 years later, still at it. Llama trip, 8 of us, going into a high plateau above Escalante, Utah. And in fact, we had more winter in that mid-October than we've had since. Anton Flat is up at the top of a plateau, and the way up from Escalante town is up the slick rock here. Here's our party, Alan Pratt, I think Kitty Barkley here on the right, packer, BJ Orozco. He's the guy who makes it happen. In fact, he talked to the Mountaineers several weeks ago, leading the llamas up the way. Up and up and up the sandstone incline to get to the plateau on top. And that plateau is where we're going to cross and make a camp. And like a lot of llama trips, we explore in every direction because there's something to be seen in every direction, just something stunning around every corner. Down our drainage towards Death Hollow, plenty of water. In fact, this October, water flowing, water rippling, water bubbling. And we came to a point where we can look off our little drainage into Death Hollow, which has a nasty name, but it's just the most spectacular unheralded canyon that I know of, about 1,000 feet deep, perennial stream, trout down in there. In the background, you see the Aquarius Plateau, which is the name of which is degraded into Boulder Mountain in recent years. Like a lot of canyon trips, a lot of canyon stair step, and those stair steps are very difficult to get around, except with technical techniques, which we don't particularly do on these trips. That's patty walls, looking into the water, looking into the reflections, and looking down off the top as the canyon makes its next leap downward on the way down to Death Hollow. We did find a way down, working our way down the slick rock ridge on the right side of what we're seeing here. And we're able to look back up at the cliffs. Another view from the top, and here's a typical loop. So the point I want to make here is it's all cross country. There are almost no trails. So if you get out for 4 to 6 miles, you have a busy day and you'll be plenty tired at the end of the day. We woke up the next morning and this is what we saw. Early October, but the weather didn't care about that. In fact, of course, it's gorgeous to see snow in the slick rock country, and this was no exception. The river was running, our little stream was running high. The snow didn't last long, but it was wet for quite a while. Brent Cordova, second from the right, Patty Walls, Dennis Brandt in the middle, Kenny Barkley, second from the left, Kathleen Gritzmacher. And what used to be bare rock, bare dry drainage, perhaps a few days ago, was a waterfall, and there were waterfalls everywhere. So we got out and we explored. You can see how folks are dressed. Not the warmest of outings. Sunset as the storm cleared out. One drainage over. I mean, there. Another explore another day. Here's some artifacts. And here's just how rugged that country is. And the bare rock, the earth is open to the universe when the soil is gone because it was never there. Slick rock. It's called slick rock not because you slip on it, because if you're a horse with iron shoes, you will slip on it. Exploring, following the grain of the land, heading up and seeing what we can see. We're not targeting a known destination, and we're certainly not following a trail. Fearless leader. And the view in the background to Anton Ridge, which is the edge of that. If you get to the top of that, you would then look down on Double Escalante town. Here's a trip out. It is always a relief. These are llama drop camps. Packer takes us in, leaves us, says, good luck, I'll see you in 6 days. And it's always a relief on the 6th morning to see BJ and his crew coming back to get us out and take us to civilization. We may not want to be in civilization particularly, but it's the plan and we want to get there. So this is kind of explores that one can do in a week-long trip. And, this whole we probably could put everything we did within a 5-mile circle, but there's no end of adventure within even such a small space. That was a cold trip. This is a wet trip that we ran on a tributary to the Escalante River. Here's the Escalante coming down from the north. Scorpion Gulch and Fool's Canyon is drainage which we hadn't explored for a long time, which we thought it's about appropriate that us fools ought to go look at Fool's Canyon. And off we went. In the midst of recurrent drought, we seem to have quite a habit of getting out into the canyon country in the wettest days of the year. That's Rashi ire, ready to roll. And the llamas coming down through the wet. I think this drainage is perfectly dry most of the year, but here we are crossing it and wading across it in the floodwaters after a storm. I mean, this is not only is it lovely to be out in the wet. This is, by the way, our potty system traveling along in the hands of BJ the Llama Packer. It's not only pretty, it's not only different. Hitting a wet spell means you can camp places that are otherwise too dry because you can't camp without water. Now, llamas don't care wet or dry. So this is our camp, new pools, new floods, still raining. Our camp's, within a few steps of here. Mary Thompson posing here. Moki balls. These are not the nicest ones of them. They're more denser, more blacker, iron-rich concretions, but you find them everywhere in this country. They cover the landscape. This, in fact, is a perennial water feature. It was still there in a dry trip in the spring of 2021. It's called Gates Tank. And that's the kind of place where even in dry years, there's water to be found and you can camp if you know the places to go. Here we are looking down into Fool's Canyon and back at camp. And just when water was starting to get short, about Wednesday, midweek, the rain started again and the water came back. Waterfalls and waterfalls. Come back here a month later and there's nothing here but rock. But we had enough clear weather to get a feel of where we were to enjoy the spot. You can see how we've set up camp to keep ourselves dry and comfortable. The sun shelter is actually a great rain shelter. We did spend some mornings huddled there until we gathered the courage to get out and hike. Rashi again, next to our new river. Heading up on top of one of the mesas that populate this terrain. And going cross country to the next canyon up, Scorpion Gulch, Scorpion Flat. That is the scorpion's tail in the background, that little pointy thing, the stinger. What used to be a flat is lakes after a rain like this. And all those little bumps that gravel, a lot of that is moki balls. Or it is pebbles that have been polished by the wind. Wind doesn't do a lot of macro erosion, but it does polish rocks in a wonderful way. One canyon after another, following a new river to some tributaries of the Coyote Gulch, which is a big and well-known drainage to the south of Fool's Canyon. Comfortable in camp. Campfires are perfectly legal on the high country that is not in the canyons. And on a cold trip like that, they make the difference, all the difference in the world between comfortable and not. I'm not going to speak to every picture because some of them speak to themselves. This was a day when we headed out saying, well, maybe the weather will hold up, maybe it won't, but even if we go part way, what we'll find will be beautiful. And it's amazingly so. Fearless leader. looking down into Fool's Canyon and the Escalante River itself. That back country in the background on the east side of the Escalante River, amazingly complex. I've never really figured out how to get there. It's in the bucket list. Henry Mountains in the background, I believe. And you don't see a lake like this very often. Heading home, and before you head home, this is us drying out for the way out. And the llamas to the rescue one more time. I've talked about all the comfort that you can bring by having a little more payload on a trip. This, in fact, a sit-down toilet seat, that's huge. Yeah, a huge increase to comfort. Let's see where we're going this time. Ladders Canyon. This, in fact, is the first stop of the Llama trip we're doing this fall, for which there's one spot. And we did this in a dry autumn last year, or the year before last in 2020. So things are looking a bit grimmer here in the fall of 2020, but it's the same drill. Here come the llamas, they're loaded with their gear, and off we go, looking into a piece of terrain where we'd never really been before. 44 years at it, and places we've never been before. Our water supply in a tough year, see that little pool there in this chink in the rocks? That's plenty of water to sustain you for a week. That may be Mary Thompson footsteps of us going back and forth to get river water all year. And though our camp was in the upland, we did find a way. And in fact, it's a cowboy route, a stairway down into the Escalante River. And we swam there many of the days. This is another great thing about this kind of camping, is staying clean. That between the flowing water, some pools of water, you can swim, you can wash. You don't have to be grungy and dirty. There's Rashi, in fact, doing just that in the Escalante River. Exploring up and down the river. What I've seen over the decades is that cattle came out of here a few decades ago when the National Monument formed. Though they did a lot of damage, they also tended to clear out the streamside vegetation. And in fact, much of the vegetation has grown up so much in recent years that there's a lot of places where the easiest way to go up and downstream nowadays is through the river. Rivers like this, not this part of the Escalante River, but the tributaries just a little bit upstream, they can be full of trout. I have fished in places like Sand Creek, where in 100 yards, trout that are hidden in little pockets in the vegetation at the side behind a rock. I've caught half a dozen 15-inch trout in 100 yards of river. Here's the stairway on our way out. This is what drought looks like. In past years, you can see the water level. This was once a tank to swim in. Now it's nothing. But the country's still there to explore. A gap in a big monolith was the path that we took on a hike to explore country to the south. Duncan and Molly McBranch at the top of one of these mesas looking at the country. We're looking north to Boulder Mountain in this shot. There's a piece of country called Egypt here because the explorers of the country thought that the terrain, the up and down, looked like pyramids, not like the ones that Alan Pratt just visited, but enough like Egypt that they gave it a name. Artifacts, and of course, we look at them, we photograph them, and we leave them be. That's the right thing to do. Enough water to swim. This is a pool in one of the drainages, a Duncan, Mary Thompson, but way less water than in a wetter year. Comfort around camp. I said chairs make all the difference in the world. You do wear out your pants in this kind of terrain. There I am peeking through them. This, in fact, is some of the pillars that we went to in the 2006 trip, and we're trying to find a way back up them 15 years later. Covering this terrain. This is, I wouldn't even call it technical terrain. It's steep terrain where somebody comfortable with walking around this country, somebody like me can walk up and down it. And, folks that we're trying to help introduce to the terrain, we do get out a rope. And if they feel a little more comfort by holding onto a rope as they go up or down something like this, more power to them. We're there to help. Slot canyons, these cracks in the earth. This is one that we discovered, Duncan and Molly and I, in these wanderings. And we are all graduates of Whitman College, though they are not in the same generation as I am. Escalante River, visible from the top. And the next day, in fact, the last day of the trip, we wanted to get on top of everything, the highest terrain in the vicinity. And we kind of poked around one day, and that's what it took to understand the route and plan an approach for the next day, which is to go up this canyon in the back, in fact, into the first and main country, come to the top of the mesa from above, work down the top, along this ramp, up onto this mesa, and down this rib, which looks terrifying, but it's a perfectly comfortable route to complete the loop and make our way out. So here we are, and that was our route. And to reward ourselves, back to the river, back to a swim. So that was the reconnaissance. Here is the route up this valley. In fact, we had to bypass the little canyon that we were trying to walk up, disappeared, turned into a huge hole, too steep on either side to get past. So we found another way, and that way was up the slick rock, finding a way back and forth up the ledges. There's usually a way, and up to the top of the world. And the first and main country, that crisscross country, there it is. We're seeing it from the east in this alligator type terrain, the sandstone eroded into these polygons of this sort. This is our way down. Could we do it? We weren't sure until we did do it, but it never steepened so much that we couldn't comfortably make our way down what turned to be the route down this ridge and this ridge, perfectly doable, and let us complete our trek. This is called Ladder Canyon. We finally figured out, the last morning why it's called Ladder Canyon, which I think is some decades ago, some Boy Scouts to make a way down from our plateau into a drainage of the Escalante River, bolted some aluminum ladders into the rock, which make it possible to go up and down the steepest point of the rock. Back to civilization and a motel before driving home. Happens to be my birthday that time of year. Happy birthday, Bill. So we've talked about camping trips, backpacks in the past, llama supported in the present. There are times a year, I'm not a fan of super cold or super dark weather camping. An October trip is fine. By the time November rolls around, the days are so short, the days are so cold that you're probably more comfortable not to be out there camping. It's not so fun for it to get dark at 5:30 and not get light again till 7. So it's really a very empty piece of the world. On the drive to Boulder to start one of these llama trips, which is about a 9.5-hour drive, the biggest town we go through is Farmington. And the second biggest town that you might go through is 300 people, Bluff, Utah. And these little spots I've called out here are all bases of operation from which one can make a home, rent a facility, and go out on day trips. And we've done many of those. In some ways, they're just as rewarding. And certainly that's what I enjoy most in November or December or a winter trip into the Canyon Country. Now, Moab is another story. It's gotten amazingly popular in past years. If you go, but let's talk about that. There's ways around the Moab crowds anywhere, and I think every spot on the map here is places where I've settled in and spent several days going from civilization out into the Canyon Country. So let's talk about Moab. The secret is out. It's people and people again and again into a very adventuresome part of the country. And what you think about, it's a settlement that was once a uranium town, once a tiny little settlement on the Colorado River, lower altitude, about 4,000 feet. So, a little warmer, something you go to in a cooler part of the year, and at the confluence of Arches National Park and Canyonlands National Park, and all sorts of opportunities arise. And what's Moab famous for? Cheap jamborees, motorcycles, dudes on mountain bikes, not so much wilderness solitude and quiet hikes, which is what we're out there for. But indeed, it's such a big place. There's all kinds of stuff to find regardless. It has gotten very busy. You know, this is a not unusual site at the entrance station to Arches National Park. This is the main entrance, the one that leads to the main drive. In fact, I have heard, I've never run into it myself, the facility will even close completely. When they've reached a certain maximum number of people, they say, you know, that's it. You have to wait. People have to come out before we let anybody in. And we're expecting this year that there'll be an entry system where people need reservations to get in. Not so good. Why would you possibly, you wilderness folks, want to go there? Well, here's the secret. This is the annual vehicle count at Arches National Park for a typical year. And this is what people worry about. Above the red line, the park is just too darn crowded. We go in the off season in early November, where things really have calmed down and it's not nearly as busy as other times of the year. And this is the entrance station. This is the main road, Delicate Arch, Devil's Garden, you know, all the sites, the windows, that's Devil's Delicate Arch up here, all the famous sites that everybody knows about in Arches. But there's other ways to get into Arches National Park. There's a dirt road, Willow Springs Road, which in fact used to be the route into Arches National Park in the days when Edward Abbey was a ranger riding Desert Solitaire. That's not regulated. You can walk in off the highway into the high country of the park. You can walk in Cottonwood Wash. You can walk in from the northeast up in down Lost Springs Canyon, and all of those are beat the crowds ways into Arches National Park. And it's not only that, it's not just being sneaky, it's that the crowds aren't there. You know, that's why they aren't regulating access by those routes. So here's a couple stories of this kind of access to the park. So there's a bike trail that goes up here. You can walk up the bike trail, get on the flats, and get up and above the famous parts of Arches National Park. You know, here's our route from the highway. These are mesas and valleys of which near where the highway's over here, a little bit to the east, and there's one car after another on the highway. But here's what you can do on your own. This is our entrance into Arches National Park. There's the fence. There's a gap in the fence. Off we go. And from that route, one is on the the top of the world, looking down at the features, the sculpted terrain of just as pretty as any other piece of Arches National Park. Towers, pillars, sandstone, sculpted by water over the centuries. Kathleen on a cross-country explore. Like I said, no trail. It's pretty much never a trail. This was a let's hike out there and see what's there. Cottonwood Wash in the distance, and that flows into and crosses the highway, which is somewhere here in the not the highway, but the main paved park road. There are a few ways up and down this terrain, not many, but there are ways to get from these mesas down to the flats if you so care. And I'm just admiring some of this terrain and country in silence as you are. So I'm going to wrap it here. I've talked about the country and the puzzles and the adventures, and that's what draws me there. But to me, the backcountry is a very social place too. It's many of my very best friends are friends that I've made and friendships I've sustained as we explore together, as we go into the puzzle country and see one beautiful thing after another. Those days exploring, those evenings around camp, build lifelong friendships. And here's a crew from just one such trip, one of our return trips to Dark Canyon. Campfires, legal, and just a social bond that pulls the group together. I've gotten the job of being the storyteller, not that I make up stories, but I'm the guy who reads the story. Instead of TV, we find some appropriate book, a canyon country story, an Edward Abbey, a story of the Navajo lands, and those make times where we're friends together. And I've had the privilege of decades of doing this, and I hope I'm not quite done yet. And I hope that you share in these adventures. I'll keep leading them as long as I can, and I'm not a real oldster yet, and put out several trips a year. Hope that you can join us. Perhaps once I retire here in a bit, I'll be doing even more of them. And I think Edward Abbey's blessing is something that I would sign on to just as much. Adventure, lonesome, amazing views, and the mountains go on and on. With that, I am open to questions. So I see.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Bill.
So I see one question already from Arlene. And the trout are brown trout, which are in fact not native to the Western United States. They come from Europe, but in fact, they're a pretty nice implant because most of the streams that you see, the perennial streams, are ones that come off the Aquarius Plateau. So the Aquarius Plateau extends to well above 10,000 feet, and it provides a source of springs and perennial water that flows down Death Hollow, Sand Creek, Calf Creek, and the like. The Escalante River itself is much more irregular, in part because it loses a lot of water to irrigation, which is not regular, but when the farmers are really drawing on it for irrigation, it's darn well dry.